What is Kemi Badenoch's preferred strategy for returning the Conservative Party to power by 2029? Should she wait for the Labour government to collapse under the weight of the political crises it faces? This is how the Labour opposition overturned an 80-seat Tory majority at the last election. That victory was expected to be the launch pad for extending Conservative rule to 5 parliaments, transforming this decade into the Tories' roaring 20s. Badenoch might hope that events will be the ruin of this government, but she has every reason to draw inspiration from the surging fortunes of right-of-centre parties in other Western democracies. First stop, the United States of America. President-elect Donald Trump is the poster child for a brand of back-to-the-future right-wing sophistry that voters eat up faster than fruitcake. Trump has proven that a controversy-seeking political program can have more than a whiff of sexism and racism attached to it, be hard on sexual minorities and even tougher on immigrants, and still win majority support. It can even succeed amongst racial minorities, whom pollsters had long believed would always vote in their racial and economic interests. Trump's political program will not restore working-class jobs in coal, steel, or manufacturing, because no president can do that, in an age of quarterly shareholder returns and China's unchallenged supremacy as the workshop of the world. Equally, Trump's economic protectionism will neither raise American living standards for most people, nor prevent the inexorable weakening of American power. But what Trump has shown with the most remarkable political comeback in more than 50 years, is that his conjuring trick of smoke, mirrors and full-spectrum division is an absolute vote winner. Handicapped by a poor candidate, the Democrats had no one to answer Trump's 50 states of chaos, with a full-throated rendition of It's Morning in America. So, could Trump's scorched earth strategy work in Britain? The Tories have already imported the Republican Party's taste for culture wars. The implausible, unlawful, and unworkable Rwanda deportation plan was cynically deployed by former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as a deliberate wedge issue that would coalesce and mobilize conservative voters around their opposition to migration, whilst blinding them to tax rises under the Tory government. And in Badenoch, the Conservatives already have a proven headline-grabbing culture warrior. As listeners to this podcast will remember, Badenoch was happy to trade verbal salvos with the actor David Tennant in a high-profile quarrel last year with a certified British national treasure. Badenoch was at it again, setting fire to the established code of public decency by suggesting to a journalist that not all cultures are equal. And of course, Badenoch has had no difficulty in echoing Trump's vitriolic opinion of African countries, with her own less than flattering comments on the land of her ancestors. In the MP's maiden speech in Parliament in 2017, Badenoch revealed some of the details that marked her life in Lagos. She had to do homework by candlelight because the state electricity board could not provide power. Humiliatingly, the future Tory leader was also forced to fetch water from a borehole a mile away, using heavy rusty buckets because the nationalized utility company could not get water out of the taps. Anyone familiar with the often opulent lifestyles of Africa's richest would have laughed out loud at the image manufactured by Badenoch. Endorsing Trumponomics, with its expected eye-watering tariffs on imports and other anti-China policies, would be the trade equivalent of Liz Truss dashing for growth with her mini-budget. In addition, Trump had to build a series of coalitions based on race, gender, age, and class, in order to win over the 7 swing states which guaranteed his return to the White House. Badenoch just needs Britain's constituency mathematics to align in her favor. Which brings us, neatly, to the shadow cast over the Conservative Party by Nigel Farage and the fan club that is his Reform Party. Farage is the undoubted heavyweight on the right of British politics and was as monotuned as ever in a party press conference this week, where he lambasted Britain's most recent immigration figures. In her own lukewarm press conference the previous day, Badenoch apologized for her party's inability to get a grip on migration and promised that she would soon have a plan to tackle the issue. It was a jam tomorrow tactic that would not have convinced those voters who are adamant that the migration issue is more urgent than improving the economy, tackling the cost of living crisis, reviving British industry, funding the ailing NHS, and restoring the quality of British education. Politically, Badenoch feels she can do nothing more than promise a change to immigration policy without being specific. The trouble with this holding strategy is that it leaves Reform as the only party with an unequivocal answer to the questions posed by the public about immigration. Farage is a terrific storyteller. Voters are less and less immune to his ludicrous description of migration as the blight that stops young people getting on the housing ladder and old people getting a doctor's appointment. Farage says the annual arrival in Britain of 1 million migrants explains why the motorways are gridlocked, schools are crumbling, and the healthcare debt crisis drags on. It's a good story, but it's also a tall tale. What Farage doesn't say is that migration is just the latest but most compelling excuse deployed by successive governments to explain away their defunding of public services. The country could spend more on these services, but the governing class decided long ago that this would be a poor investment. If there are fewer doctors' appointments available, it's because the health service cannot afford to provide more staff. Does anyone seriously believe that a desperate newcomer, fleeing civil war in Iraq, is the reason for the staggering gap between the cost of affordable housing and wages? But Farage is talking about young people's access to private accommodation and council housing. Well, no, because he is old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher, his political hero, selling off local authority homes to the highest bidder and detonating the housing crisis that plagues the country to this day. Since the 1970s, governments of every stripe have committed to funding health, education, and other frontline services, whilst offering only the flimsiest of explanations for why these services and their operating standards worsen decade after decade. They moaned that Britain's money didn't go quite as far as hoped after the petroshock of the mid-1970s. Then, budgets had to be tightened for the dose of deindustrialization needed to make the economy leaner and fitter. Then came the serial economic recessions, which were given as reasons for why citizens could not expect decent public services. The European institutions were later presented as the existential enemy that took our money and stopped us enjoying nice things. Our pensioners were even reproached for their temerity to live longer and place an ever greater strain on the National Health Service. None of these excuses have blinded citizens to the massive tax cuts and other sweeteners offered to the country's richest over the past 5 decades. Nor could voters ignore the sale of nationalized utilities, or the gazillions spent on renewable arms contracts and the disappearance of the peace dividend, following the collapse of communism. Ministers of every political color dared not admit what the voters understood only too well. The collapse of public services was not a bug but a feature of the system. Governments would rather fund private companies, in the form of investment inducements and tax breaks, than put the nation's treasure at the service of the people. This 50-year-long project was given its start by Margaret Thatcher, during her 11 years in power. It was continued by Tony Blair and by every single prime minister who succeeded him. The nation's political elite has been engaged in a deliberate assault on the limited pact of class solidarity that defined post-World War II Britain, and which gave birth to the welfare state. Britain's elites, through gritted teeth, conceded a publicly funded welfare state and have been finding excuses to dismantle it ever since. The fear generated by the arrival of mostly male, military-aged, visibly different migrants offers a near-perfect diversion from the tragic reality of the country's never-ending class war. Make no mistake. The current migration panic has been deliberately engineered. British ministers and their civil servants have spent the last 70 years trying to restrict the number of black and brown people entering the country. If they have failed to match the lobbying power of British business, it is not for the want of trying. The Home Office is refusing to publish a paper it commissioned in the wake of the Windrush scandal, because it would confirm that racism has been at the heart of Britain's demographic planning for 7 decades. The report, entitled The Historical Roots of the Windrush Scandal, was part of the Home Office's commitment to educating civil servants, who had been responsible for wrongly classifying as illegal immigrants thousands of black and brown Britons. A historian who has seen the document admitted to the Guardian newspaper in 2022 that between 1950 and 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed at least in part to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. Major immigration legislation in 1962 1968 and 1971 was designed to reduce the proportion of people living in the United Kingdom who did not have white skin. Farage's work continues in this tradition. He is in place to direct the people's anger away from the ruling elite and towards migrants. Britain's black and brown people will surely be next. Farage has been performing this role for 25 years. Farage got his start as the driving force behind the United Kingdom Independence Party, the political disruptor which engineered Brexit. Now he appears at the head of a party with 5 MPs, 400 constituency branches and more than 100,000 members, with an epoch-defining mission to euthanize the Conservative Party. Fighting with the Reform Party for political hegemony on the right will define Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Conservatives. Yet startlingly, this week's press conferences on migration only confirmed to voters that the Conservative Party is a pale imitation of Reform. Stealing Farage's thunder on reducing migration, without offering his message clarity, will deceive no one. As leader of the official opposition, Badenoch cannot continue to be imprecise on her party's migration plans, whilst Farage is clear that only an exit from the European Convention on Human Rights will begin the change demanded by the British people. Worse, policy delay and prevarication will only weaken the morale of the Tory party's dwindling membership. Ahead of next May's local elections, it is now set for a 6-month battle with buoyant Reform supporters, in the full knowledge that many of the political gains from this Kemi versus Nigel slugfest are likely to go to the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. The alternative, an alliance with Reform, might please the Robert Jenrick faction of the Conservative Party, but would be a mortal blow to Badenoch's reign. It would hand all of the right's political oxygen to Farage. His political skills, communication prowess, and mastery of television give him a decisive advantage over Badenoch. It also helps that newspaper editors and television hacks give him the easiest of rides. Farage presides over GB News and has extraordinary access to mainstream news programs, where he is treated as though he actually has a political record of substance. As the LBC radio host James O'Brien demonstrated over Brexit, Farage is overrated and flusters when pressed by serious journalists to explain his positions in anything other than media soundbites. However, none of this helps Kemi Badenoch now. In the most recent edition of the Electoral Dysfunction podcast, the formidable Sky News political editor Beth Rigby and her fellow panelists offered a devastating review of Badenoch's first month as leader. Her media game was terrible. Journalists were annoyed with their lack of access. Why wasn't she apologizing for 14 years of Tory mistakes? Badenoch's performances at Westminster were sometimes amateurish. Kemi was not doing enough to introduce herself to the public. Why wasn't she putting herself about more? The party needs a hustler, and Kemi isn't schmoozing enough with the political scribblers. Doesn't she have anything to say? She's missing open goals and isn't cutting through. It's a complete mess. Baroness Ruth Davidson, the scabrous former leader of Scotland's Conservative Party, saved her most ruthless put-down until last. She said Badenoch should not allow herself to be neither high-handed nor lazy. She should humble herself and work bloody hard to improve the party's fortunes. Black listeners everywhere shuddered. The labeling of black people in public life as lazy is a train that is never late. The ill word was also high in the mission statement of former Conservative Minister Nadine Dorries, as she toured media studios to promote her new book and give her views on the Conservative Party. Simultaneously, Dorries hoped to repair her public image as a cheerleader for the disgraced Boris Johnson and an irritant to viewers on the popular UK television show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. The former Minister of Culture was quick to put on record her loyalty to the Conservative Party, but then made pointless this display of fidelity by pointing to the barn-door-sized opportunity for the single-issue Reform Party, which could soon eat the Tories' lunch. After posting the Conservative Party's death certificate, Dorries trashed the cabal of Tory kingmakers, whom she said have caused chaos in the party, by removing successive prime ministers and installing the current leader. Stand up, Michael Gove, Dominic Cummings, and Dougie Smith. Your cover has been blown. In her book, entitled Downfall, Dorries quotes an unnamed source with direct experience of working with Government Minister Badenoch. Kemi's temper, her aloofness, her rudeness, but mostly, her well-known aversion to hard work, will eventually blow her up, Dory's interviewee claims. Is this the dark secret that explained why a majority of Tory MPs were unimpressed by Badenoch's leadership credentials? Dory's mission was not finished. She dropped the nugget that a civil servant was forced to go through Badenoch's red boxes, with the minister otherwise engaged. Laziness now follows an accusation of narcissism, as the latest character failing to attach itself to Badenoch. Few political commentators have anything positive to say about Badenoch's debating skills at Prime Minister's questions, which leaves the new Tory leader struggling even more to throw off the emerging view that she has been overpromoted. Last summer, The Guardian did its best to prove Badenoch was unfit for leadership by publishing a grievous hit piece dedicated to proving that she was difficult to work with. Badenoch was accused of bullying and traumatizing her staff, who claimed that she oversaw a toxic environment at the Department for Business and Trade during her 17 months as Secretary of State. According to The Guardian, staff dreaded meetings, as they claimed individuals were regularly left feeling humiliated by Badenoch. On a handful of occasions, some staff members were reduced to tears after meeting with Badenoch. One insider said Badenoch's criticism of civil servants came across as sustained and personal. During Badenoch's time as business secretary, other ministers in the department are understood to have checked in on the well-being of staff, while officials tried to ensure that colleagues who had allegedly been targeted by Badenoch were not left alone with her in case she upset them. The allegations never became the subject of an official investigation, but sources told the newspaper that officials had spoken privately to the department's permanent secretary, Gareth Davies, about Badenoch's alleged behavior. It may be that Badenoch is a difficult woman, whose own high standards make her as demanding of her colleagues and staff as she is of herself. But high-achieving black people, who are used to navigating predominantly white spaces, will see in the anonymous criticism of Badenoch much that is depressingly familiar. That said, in the rough and tumble of high-stakes politics, such a line of attack is only to be expected. For years, Jeremy Corbyn was portrayed as a committed anti-Semite by the British press. Members of his own shadow cabinet, including the current Prime Minister, colluded in hounding Corbyn from the leadership of the Labour Party. Fellow London MP Diane Abbott's mailbag is full of death threats and racist insults, the fruit of 30 years of sustained public ridicule. David Cameron was a lightweight, laughed at for his high-profile cycling and for eating a sausage roll with a knife and fork, until power gave him gravitas. Rishi Sunak was the obscenely rich, Californian midget who didn't get politics, nor its stagecraft. Theresa May was a childless, provincial, charisma bypass robot in kitten heels, whilst the hapless Liz Truss will forever be remembered as a rotting lettuce. A Conservative Party spokesperson said the allegations made against Badenoch were completely false and a flagrant smear, but Dory's book-selling sensationalism will revive doubts about the character of the former business secretary, concerns which have marked her meteoric rise to the top of the party. Britons who disagree with Badenoch's political positions but nevertheless have more than a little admiration for her grit, tenacity, and evident talent, will tremble at what the commentariat might have in store for the Tory leader and her family. The electoral calendar requires Badenoch to have a compelling program ready to go soon after the New Year celebrations. She must rebuild Boris Johnson's Red Wall coalition of 2019. Badenoch also has to deliver a strong immigration position. This policy must keep her party's hardliners on side but not dismay moderates, nor enrage business-first conservatives. And sooner, rather than later, Badenoch will have to produce a reading of the British economy that puts clear blue water between her party and the Labour government. This is a priority for the North West Essex MP, who criticised the last Conservative government for campaigning from the right and governing from the left. But how can the Conservatives construct a new philosophy, with the British economy so enfeebled by Brexit and subject to commercial and geopolitical forces that often defy the will of a British Prime Minister? Badenoch gave a clue to her thinking, in a speech to the Confederation of British Industry. She began with a humble brag. "I tried to lift the burden off businesses, often arguing with other parts of government, or trying to stop them bringing in yet more well-meaning but burdensome regulation. This is partly how we have got ourselves into a state where debt is at record levels, and we are spending more on debt servicing than on health, education, or defense. Badenoch did not elaborate on how 14 years of conservative rule contributed to the record levels of debt. Instead, she skipped on to what George Bush Sr. would have called the vision thing, by discussing the need for change and the importance of growth. It is not government that creates growth. It is business, Badenoch declared. This sentence was surely written as an applause line, a signal to Chicago school sympathizers among her audience, that she had read Thomas Sowell and was one of them. The line did not land because no one listening really wanted the government to get out of the way. Government contracts and access to the public purse are huge generators of income for British businesses of every size. Badenoch plowed on. People want the government to fix everything. They want the government to solve everything. And if you ever sound hesitant, you are made out to be a cruel, unfeeling person. Here was Badenoch cosplaying as Thatcher the milk snatcher. The bottom line is that economic growth is not the end in itself, she said. It is a means to an end. The end is to make people's lives better. Badenoch's speech showed that she is thinking about the state's relationship with its citizens, but her prescription does not appear to match the scale of the problems she identifies. All too predictably, Badenoch's remedy is drawn from the same well pool of ideas that has given us just-in-time supply chains, zero-hours contracts, the gig economy, flexi-security employment laws, asset stripping, trickle-down economics, and the relocation of jobs to China, etc., etc. Politics needs to accept boundaries, Badenoch claimed later in her speech. This is the conservatives' code for government looking the other way, as business ruthlessly exploits employment fears, cuts real wages and ignores health and safety regulations and environmental protection laws. The conservative leader was not finished with her newspeak. I'm often criticized for talking about capitalism, said Badenoch, inexplicably. Someone once told me that capitalism is old-fashioned. I don't think so. I think it is important that we explain what capitalism in a free market environment means. Goodness, was Badenoch about to answer her own question, throwing over the table of the money lenders in their London power base, in disgust at their usury and sharp practice? Would she tell her audience that capitalism had delivered billions out of poverty but at the cost of gargantuan kleptocracy, widening inequalities, and a devastated, depleted, strife-ridden planet? There was no chance of such a mea culpa. Instead, Badenoch blazed on with a serenade for Adam Smith. Capitalism is not a dirty word. Wealth is not a dirty word. Profit is not a dirty word. But we need to start explaining how these things deliver for the people out there, people who often think that we are in it for ourselves and we the politicians are in cahoots. Here Badenoch was surely letting the cat out of the bag. Hallelujah, Kemi. Go tell it like it is. We need an alternative strategy, so we can finally unleash the power of business to make our country better. We can no longer tolerate a situation where building roads takes decades. Where Treasury decision-making means railways don't get built. Where the planning system stops investments being made by you and your colleagues. So there you have it. Badenoch's big plan is to turn Britain into a mini China, with planning laws junked and businesses given free rein to unleash their full potential on all of us, whether we like it or not. Left-of-center media outlets played gotcha with Badenoch's refusal to rule out reversing the government's increase in employers' national insurance. But just as she was the darling of the farmers attending last week's Westminster Street protest, so Badenoch's economic analysis found the sweet spot of her business-friendly audience. We await the conclusions of the Conservatives' policy review, but for now, Badenoch, in her first big speech on the economy since becoming leader, has at least established the bare bones of her approach. Badenoch's plan is not quite the Singapore-on-Thames that her more breathless Brexiteer colleagues might have hoped for, but it does burnish the leader's Thatcherite credentials and might be used to seduce the near 3 million people who have signed a petition calling for a general election. And at least, Badenoch isn't calling in William Rees-Mogg to discuss his disturbing idea for sovereign cities. For that, we should all be grateful. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe to our Master's Blankets, as your support really helps us to keep going. We'll be back soon with another episode of Kemi Can't Win. Please join us on the next one.